They promised these measures were temporary. That was 800 years ago. Welcome to a journey through history's most persistent pattern, the emergency measure that becomes permanent law, the crisis solution that outlives the crisis by centuries. Throughout medieval times, rulers faced emergencies that demanded immediate action. They imposed temporary measures, taxes, laws, systems, promising they would last only until the danger passed. But something remarkable happened. Again and again, these emergency measures forgot to end. Today, we're going to explore how medieval panic, plague, war, and crisis created the institutions you still live under. How temporary solutions became permanent features of modern life. How medieval emergencies shaped the world of 2025. Let's discover the emergency measures that never ended. France, 1188. Jerusalem has fallen to Saladin's forces. King Philip II faces a crisis. He needs to fund a crusade immediately, but the royal treasury is empty. His advisors propose something unprecedented, a universal tax, 10% of everyone's income and movable property. Rich and poor alike, even the clergy must pay. This violates every feudal custom. Taxation is supposed to be irregular and negotiated, not universal and mandatory. But this is an emergency. The decree is explicit, this tax is temporary. The official document states clearly, until the Holy Land is recovered. Tax collectors spread across France, tables appear in every market square, the coins accumulate rapidly. Within months, the crusade is funded, ships are built, armies march east. The crusade ends in victory, defeat, or negotiated truce. The emergency is over, but the tax finds new justification. We need it for coastal defense now. Actually, we need it for road maintenance. We need it for royal administration. Each reason sounds legitimate, each extension seems reasonable, and slowly the emergency tax becomes permanent revenue. By 1300, just over a century later, no one remembers the tax was temporary. By 1400, it's simply how government works. The emergency created the institution. The crisis created the system. And that system, with different names and modified rates, never stopped collecting. 8 centuries later, every modern income tax system traces its ancestry back to this temporary, medieval emergency tax. Every April, when you file your taxes, you're responding to a 1188 emergency that ended 800 years ago. The crisis passed. The emergency measure remained. England, October 1066. William of Normandy has conquered England at the Battle of Hastings, but conquering is very different from controlling. William faces an immediate emergency. Saxon rebels refuse Norman rule. They meet in darkness, plot in secret, strike at night. His Norman soldiers are vastly outnumbered. William's solution is brutally simple. If rebels plot in darkness, remove the darkness. Issues an emergency decree. Every evening at 8 o'clock, all fires must be covered, all candles extinguished. The order is called couvre-feu, cover the fire. Curfew, church bells ring at 8 and all England goes dark. It's draconian. It disrupts centuries of custom, but William insists it's necessary and temporary, just until Saxon resistance ends, just until Norman rule is secure. Here's what happens next. 1070, Norman rule is secure. The curfew continues. 1100, all resistance has ended. The curfew continues. 1150, Normans and Saxons have intermarried. The curfew continues. Why? Because a new emergency emerged. Medieval towns, packed with timber-framed buildings and thatched roofs, lived in constant terror of fire. One spark could destroy an entire neighborhood in hours. The conquest emergency became a fire safety emergency. The security measure became a fire prevention measure. The temporary curfew became permanent public safety policy. By 1200, by 1300, no one remembers William's conquest, but the bell rings every evening, now protecting against a completely different emergency. Some English towns rang curfew bells into the 1800s, 7 centuries after William's temporary measure. The emergency changed. The emergency measure persisted, finding new crises to solve. Venice, 1348. Ships arrive from the east carrying the Black Death. The Venetian authorities face an unprecedented emergency. Half the city could die within months. Someone proposes a radical solution, make incoming ships wait offshore. If no one develops symptoms after 40 days, quarantagiorni in Italian, the ship may dock. Quarantine, it's never been done before, it will devastate trade. Merchants will lose fortunes, but the emergency demands action. The first ships anchor in the Venetian lagoon, forbidden to approach the city. Crews watch Venice from a distance for 40 days. Some develop plague and die at anchor. Others complete their quarantine healthy and dock safely. The emergency measure works. Venice suffers significantly less than other major cities, but the plague returns in waves. 1361, 1369, 1374, 1383. Each time, quarantine proves its value. Between outbreaks, officials debate ending the emergency measure, but they always decide to maintain it, just in case, just until we're sure the plague won't return. The plague eventually fades from Europe, but quarantine doesn't. Venice builds permanent quarantine islands, Lazaretto Vecchio in 1423. These aren't temporary facilities. They're substantial stone structures, hospitals, warehouses, permanent infrastructure for a temporary emergency. These quarantine islands operated for 5 centuries. Some functioned into the 1900s, and then came 2020. When COVID-19 swept the world, what did modern governments do? They implemented quarantine, isolation periods, waiting for symptoms to appear or fade. The word itself, quarantine, still echoes that 1348 Venetian emergency. The duration changed from 40 days to 14, but the principle remained pure medieval. 6 centuries separated the crises. The emergency measure bridged them both. Some emergency solutions are so effective they become permanent infrastructure, waiting silently through peaceful centuries, ready when crisis inevitably returns. Bologna 1088. Europe faces an intellectual crisis. Knowledge is being lost. Ancient texts are crumbling. Learning is confined to scattered monasteries. The continuity of civilization itself seems threatened. The solution: gather scholars in one place, create a studium generale, a university. They establish temporary ranks to organize learning: baccalaureus, bachelor, the beginning student, magister, master, the advanced scholar, doctor, teacher of teachers, highest authority. These are practical, expedient categories. They're not meant to be permanent or universal. They're just what works for this emergency. But the system spreads rapidly. Paris adopts it in 1150, Oxford in 1167, Cambridge in 1209. Each university faces its own version of the emergency, preserving learning, training clergy. Educating administrators. The temporary ranks become standardized across Europe. Bachelor, master, doctor, the emergency hierarchy becomes permanent academic structure. Nearly 1,000 years later, these emergency degrees dominate global education. Your bachelor's degree, a rank created during a 12th century knowledge crisis. Your master's, an emergency teaching credential. Your doctorate, a temporary solution to intellectual emergency. The crisis that created universities ended centuries ago. Books are preserved. Learning is widespread. Literacy is nearly universal. But the emergency measure, the 3-tiered degree system, the academic regalia, the graduation ceremonies, all unchanged, following emergency protocols from when literacy itself seemed threatened. Every graduation ceremony you've attended follows emergency procedures from a crisis nearly a millennium old. England, 1215. King John faces a legal emergency. The church has condemned trial by combat and trial by ordeal. How do you determine guilt or innocence without divine judgment? The Magna Carta proposes an emergency alternative, trial by jury. Let 12 ordinary men judge their peers. It's experimental, it's temporary. It's a stopgap until legal scholars develop something more sophisticated. The first juries are awkward. 12 farmers or merchants, uncomfortable with authority, judging cases they barely understand. They deliberate in confusion, reach verdicts by compromise. It's clearly not meant to last. But here's what happened. 1300, still 12 jurors. 1500, still 12 jurors. 1700, still 12 jurors. Now in colonial America, 1789. Enshrined in the US Constitution, 2025, still 12 jurors in courtrooms worldwide. The emergency experiment became a constitutional right. The temporary measure became the foundation of justice in democracies globally. Today, walk into any American or British courtroom. Count the jurors, 12. Watch them deliberate privately, just as those confused medieval farmers did 800 years ago. The procedures are more refined, but the core system is unchanged. The legal emergency of 1215 ended centuries ago. Modern legal theory has advanced exponentially. Yet the emergency measure remains unaltered because it works. When you receive a jury summons, you're responding to an 810-year-old emergency that ended within years of its creation. England, 1266. King Henry III faces a monetary crisis. Currency is chaos, coins of different weights and purities, rampant counterfeiting, trade breaking down. The emergency solution: standardize currency by weight. Call the basic unit a pound because it literally weighs 1 pound of sterling silver. Simple, clear, temporary until a better system emerges, and better systems did emerge. Repeatedly, silver coins got smaller, then they weren't silver at all, paper money arrived. Then plastic cards, then digital transfers. Every single aspect of the monetary system transformed completely, except one thing: the name. Today, British currency is called pounds. Pounds of nothing, not weighed on any scale. Just pounds, a linguistic ghost of a 750-year-old emergency weight standard. Watch global financial markets. GBP British pound trades billions of times per second. Digital, abstract, completely weightless. It's still bearing the name of an emergency measure that Henry III implemented in 1266. The monetary emergency ended almost immediately. Better systems did replace it over and over, century after century. But the emergency terminology, that survived every revolution in currency, every transformation in finance, every technological advancement. You spend pounds that weigh nothing, named for an emergency that your ancestors' faced. Language is the most persistent emergency measure of all. Words preserve crises long after the crises themselves have been solved and forgotten. Medieval Europe 1200s. Crafts face an emergency. Knowledge is being lost as master craftsmen die without passing on their skills. Quality declines. Ancient techniques disappear. The guilds create an emergency training system, apprenticeship. A boy, usually age 12, binds himself to a master for 7 years. He learns every secret of the trade in exchange for his labor. It's an emergency response to preserve dying arts. It's crude. It's exploitative. The apprentice works long hours for no pay, often poorly treated, learning through observation and occasional instruction. Surely better educational methods will emerge. They did. Universities spread, books multiply, literacy rises, technical schools appear, community colleges, YouTube tutorials. The emergency that created apprenticeship, the fear of losing craft knowledge, has been completely solved by mass education and information technology. Yet apprenticeship continues unchanged. 1400s, still 7-year apprenticeships. 1600s, still master and apprentice. 1800s, surviving the Industrial Revolution. 2000s, thriving in modern trades. Today, visit any electrical company, plumbing business, or construction site. You'll find apprentices, young people bound to masters, learning through hands-on training, serving years before certification. The terminology is explicitly medieval: apprentice. Journeyman, master. The structure is unchanged. Years of training, demonstration of skill, certification by experts. 7 centuries of educational innovation haven't produced a better way to teach complex physical skills than the medieval emergency system. The emergency measure survived because it works. Sometimes we can't improve on emergency solutions, even with centuries of trying. Medieval villages, 1300s. Communities face a social crisis, isolation, lack of public space. Manor halls serve nobility, churches serve God, but where do common people gather? The emergency solution, the alehouse, a private home that sells ale, providing public space for community. It's informal, makeshift, temporary until better social infrastructure develops. Because most villagers can't read, alehouses hang symbols outside: a red lion, a white horse, crossed keys. Visual markers for an illiterate population, temporary signage for a temporary solution. Over the centuries, the social emergency resolves. Public squares are built, town halls appear, literacy becomes universal, countless gathering places emerge. The reason for alehouses completely disappears, yet the alehouses remain. They evolve into taverns, then pubs, public houses, but the function stays identical. Today, traditional pubs still serve the function created by medieval social emergency. They still hang those visual symbols, now purely decorative, literacy having eliminated their original purpose centuries ago. Walk into a British pub, see those timber beams, often original medieval wood. Notice the hanging sign outside, still showing pictorial symbols designed for people who couldn't read. The emergency that created pubs ended with urbanization, clubs, cafes, and countless modern gathering options. But the emergency solution became so culturally embedded that ending it became unthinkable. It survived not through necessity, but through tradition. Sometimes emergency measures become cultural treasures, beloved precisely because they're old, preserved long after their practical purpose has vanished. England, 1295. King Edward I faces a political crisis. He needs funds for wars in Scotland and France. The nobility refuses to pay unless they have a say in how money is spent. Edward's emergency solution, the model parliament, not just nobles and clergy but also representatives from towns and counties. Let them debate, then tax them. It's a temporary expedient to solve an immediate financial crisis. Once the wars are funded, surely proper governance will resume. The first meeting is chaos. Nobles, clergy and commoners, 3 estates that have never assembled as equals. They don't know procedures. They argue without structure. It's obviously experimental and temporary. But the temporary assembly proves useful. It legitimizes taxation. It provides a forum for grievances. It prevents